Hey everyone. So today is really my great pleasure to successfully invited Doris. So I have been aware of her work for quite some time, but I haven't really get a real feeling of what she's working on. But I feel like her work is very well within the scope of our program. So it's really a pleasure to have her today. Um, so just a formal introduction about her. Doris is currently a PhD, a postdoc in Nathan Cutt's group at the Applied Math Department at University of Washington. Before that, last year, she just finished her PhD at an Eric Shear-Brown's group, also at UW, and also working with Stefan Mihalas from Allen Institute of Brain Research. Before that, she was an undergraduate in the math department at Princeton and also a research assistant in the mechanical engineering department. So I believe today she will talk to us a little bit about what she has been working on during her PhD and maybe dabbing a little bit into what her current research exciting work is going to be. So without further ado, I will just hand over to Doris.
Thank you so much, Echo, for the introduction. Um, I'm super happy to meet everybody here and super glad this event is taking place and organized online and at Dartmouth. So the title of my talk is Network Mechanisms for Searching Neuronal Dynamics. And as you can tell from the title, so neuronal, I'm a computational neuroscientist and applied mathematician. So in computational neuroscience, how does that differentiate us from regular neuroscientists? We're concerned with network-based approaches, statistics, models, and theoretical approaches that can shed light on the brain's capabilities and uncovering basic mechanism of brain functionality. In recent years, there's been an explosion of data, both mapping connection between neurons that are called synapses, but also recording the activity of many neurons at the same time to map them in the brain. There used to be the case that only a few neurons, we were able to record from only a few neurons, and scientists were painstakingly trying to record these action potentials, spikes of neurons in various tasks, and put them together as if somehow they fired together. That's not the case today. We have sophisticated techniques, and sure, there's even more place to for progress, but we're able to map the brain quite well. And now there still are a lot of biophysically realistic models, which are these kind of RC circuits where we can write quite realistic biological equations based on RC circuits about how a neuron spikes, and put these together across many neurons. So that's kind of at the end of on the end of one spectrum of biological realism. At the same time, there's more, like, sometimes on the other end of the spectrum, we sometimes work with artificial neural networks where these units, you might be familiar with artificial neural networks, maybe even train some of them. It's been really an explosion in this field as well of machine learning and deep learning. These units here, they're different from these biologically realistic units in that they're idealized units determined by just a scalar real number, right? So we work with various models at one end of the spectrum or the other. I work actually somewhere in the middle as a computational neuroscience. So as you'll see in the talk, I work with firing rates, which are average spike rates. and population level firing rates. So one of the main things I'm interested in is how these network architectures give rise to simple and more sophisticated behavior in animals. So we have the architecture of circuits, which are just like the structure and the logic of the network. So in terms of the cell types that form the circuit, these cell types can be determined through recordings or morphological aspects of the neuron or connectivity. So there's different types, and then there's connection between these types. So these networks have specific architectures, and so I'm interested how these networks are able to give rise to a wide array of behaviors in animals, and how biological organisms can survive and thrive in their environments thanks to the neural circuitry, which has been developed through millions of years in evolution and through their own learning in their environments, right? That is the general question I'm interested in, but I focused a bit more on the idea of network flexibility. So understanding how biological and artificial general purpose architectures perform sophisticated tasks. So a specific problem I focus on here is context adaptation and switching. So we know humans and other animals navigate different landscapes and environments effortlessly, a feat that requires the brain's ability to rapidly and accurately generalize across context and background. So for example, the cheetah here, it's able to go from moving to static, and so the visual field of the animal during the moving and static states changes quite a bit, and so the brain of the animal needs to adapt to the different visual input it gets during the two states. So while biological organisms are very skillful in these transitions between environments, we don't quite understand how we can translate this to artificial neural networks. So one of my projects in my PhD concerned kind of generalization across context for artificial neural networks. We're able to currently design quite successfully artificial neural networks that are very good at performing a specific task and train it on many examples, but the problem of generalization across context is still quite an important problem in the field. So it would be nice to, like in the case of a self-driving car, for instance, we'd like the car to kind of adapt to driving in different countries or traffic conditions and roads, and to sort of effortlessly switch between these situations. So it would be nice to then leverage the knowledge we've gained from biology to design artificial neural network that switches context. Let me kind of give an overview of how I want to structure this talk. So first I'm going to talk about network architectures that adapt to context. And this will be in biology for a specific network in the visual system. Then I'm going to look at how this network in the visual system switches between contexts. So the static and moving context that I was kind of talking about in the example of the cheetah. And finally, or well, the second or third part will be kind of looking at artificial neural networks and maybe how we can design motifs for switching contexts. And finally, during my pose, I'll talk a bit about work I'm doing now, which is quite different. But I think actually I haven't focused on networks per se, but I think I can and would like to kind of bring it back to, okay, I want to identify low dimensional dynamics in these non-autonomous switching noisy systems, which are exactly what we're looking for in biology, right? Everything is changing dynamically all the time, and they're very noisy. And so this is perfect for biology, but tying it back maybe in the future to sort of this question of what kind of networks produce this. Okay, so let's dive in now. So we would like I'm focusing on the visual system. So we'd like to design this model of visual processing that works in general for circuit adaptation to different contexts, but also in particular for switching between moving and static states. This is kind of what I want to achieve. Adaptation in this case means that the neural activities and connectivities are sort of tuned to the statistical regularities of the context. And so you can say that we're implementing these normative models where circuits respond optimally to different contextual statistics. So I'm asking, what kind of circuit would be optimal for this world, for the statistics that are present, for the features, the statistics of the features that appear in this world? And I start from a probabilistic framework, which I don't show here for simplicity, and I do some math to figure out, okay, what do I need? What can I describe statistics of the input? And then I get to this model that I'm going to describe. Let's look at this condensed let's look at this condensed sort of circuit schematic. So neurons here in the visual cortex respond to particular patches of space. These are called the receptive field of the neuron, so particular portions in your visual field. And to certain simplistic features, at least in the primary, or at least like early on in the visual system, we don't respond to very complex stimuli, but rather very simple kind of horizontal or like different like gratings of different orientations. So we call these features, like these features resemble Gabor filters, if you've heard of them. So neurons receive this feed forward input that comes from the visual space through the retina, and then other areas process in the nervous system process them. And then neurons get most activated when the stimulus in their receptive field matches some corresponding filter. So this neuron responds very well to this minus 45 degree angle, and this one responds to a plus 45 degree angle. But in addition to this feed forward input, nearby neurons also communicate. And so there's this weight, or like this synaptic connection with the weight. So it can be, the synaptic connection can be stronger or weaker. And this synaptic connection can come with a little time delay, delta t, as any physical process. Any physical process basically takes time. Basically what we show is that or we designed this model, the model that I designed is such that it matches experimental data showing that the strength of this connection is proportional to how often features corresponding to these neurons co-occur together. So if two features fx and fy in the visual field appear together often, the weight between neurons corresponding to these features will be high. The weight will be high. The connection will be strong. If these features co-occur together rarely, the weight corresponding to the weight between neurons corresponding to these features will be negative and strong, because they're inversely sort of related, like when one feature appears, the other doesn't. And if they just co-occur together by chance, the weight's going to be close to zero, so the connection will be small. So we designed this model so that it works like this, and this is kind of what we see in experimental data. Again, there's a paper in 2021, I believe, that goes into how to describe such a model more closely. But basically, we applied this model to images and videos corresponding to static and moving contexts. And so we have like the moving and getting the features and the synaptic weights that would be ideal in such a visual field for images and for videos. Right. And so for videos in particular, this delta T delay is very important because now we're interested in how much features co-occur together while they're separated by a delta T sort of time delay, the delay it takes for the input for neurons to communicate to each other. This becomes very important. For the static scene, it sort of doesn't matter because everything stays the same, right? So we're going to get two sets of weights and the corresponding firing rates for that. One is for the static input and one is for the moving input. With W static and FR static, so this is just the firing rate of neurons during the static exposure of the animal to images. We completely describe a static circuit because we're saying how much the neurons fire and how connected they are. This is actually the model that I've been talking about. So W static is going to be an average of the probability of these features co-occurring normalized by just how often they co-occur in the environment. And we can, if you want and you're interested, I can talk about how this formula even comes into place. But anyway, let's not worry about that. So let's just think of this as something that was obtained mathematically through Bayesian kind of computations, and this describes a circuit that is very well positioned to get visual input from static scenes and sort of make out what it is, reproduce it well, like kind of like in an autoencoder sense, right? And the same for the moving circuit. We describe it through W moving and the firing rate of the moving circuit. So now we have these two circuits, which are optimal in two different contexts. And these circuits like sort of store the spatiotemporal statistics they best represent interconnections. Oh yeah, these are the two circuits I've been talking about. I've sort of both in visual cortex, we have both excitatory and inhibitory population. So these circuits are able to do this. Yes. So actually, so this kind of responds to the first kind of aspect I've been asked, or so the first part of what I've been asking. So how do you design a network architecture that adapts to context? So I have the synaptic connection between weights and kind of how they fire. And so this model sort of describes adaptation to context. But the problem is that there's no two circuits for static and moving in the brain. There's one visual system that adapts to both. So now the question is how to design a model that switches context. Yes, question.
Could you go back one slide more? I was just um I was just wondering like if there is any difference, because to my eyes there does seem to be a difference between like the static versus the moving circuits. So the only difference between those is basically the time difference, right? Like the delta t,
Exactly.
the weights updating.
Correct.
Okay.
Like basically the difference is here in this delta t, because now these features, you have different spatiotemporal statistics. The spatiotemporal statistics for images, they don't have the temporal component, right? So I can ask how much does this feature co-occur with, like how much does the feature on the elk in this position kind of co-occur with the feature here in the position next to it. Okay. But now in the video case, I ask how often does like say a feature here or like the kind of the red square co-occur with an fx and fy, but now they're time delayed, and so it's no longer the same sort of probabilities and things that we're talking about even.
Just one more question and then I will, sorry to let you continue. So the math part for the static part, you're considering like two scenarios. But for the moving moving circuits, you're only considering like one time point and one scenario, and then the next time point and then the next scenario, correct? Or
Yeah, I'm just sort of modeling it as if what happens when the animal is static, right? Yeah, in a way, yeah, what happens when, yeah, it's just every time point I think you're correct. Every time point I'd get I'm just, it's almost like assuming that delta t is 0. Like there's no, well, I guess there is a synaptic delay. It just doesn't matter because the animal is static, and I'm not worrying here of what happens when you're static and then something moves. Then like, let's say magically the moving circuit would be able to do it. I'm just worried in the static circuit, what happens if you just see static images? What does a circuit like that do? How do you sort of optimally process images?
okay.
Right.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not worrying about time at all, right? But the thing is that there will be differences in how you process images and videos if you want to be really good at it and sort of adapt to statistics. And so, but this doesn't happen in the brain. There's one circuit that, or there's no reason to separate the two circuits, right? So we want to basically implement the static visual processing and the moving visual processing in the same network architecture. So this is where I'm going with the talk, right? So let's look a little bit at biology and what's going on So in V1, in visual cortex, so visual, going to denote the primary visual cortex where we're looking as V1. Neural activations of specific classes of neurons are different during static than during moving states. So when mice were moving, it was discovered that some neurons had a higher activation rate. So there's been like a lot of experimental studies that describe the V1 circuit in much detail, specifying neuronal cell types and characterizing connectivities between them. So we know there's 4 populations we're sort of interested in: pyramidal excitatory neurons, SST inhibitory, PV inhibitory, that do sort of like this normalization operation, it's believed. But we're very much interested in this talk, as you'll see, in this neuron population called the VIP, which is activated, we've seen experimentally, so in many studies so far, that it's kind of activated in a switch-like manner to movement. And so when the animal starts moving, this neuron population, you can actually see it here, the correlation between animal speed. Just by eye, you can see the correlation between animal speed and like sort of the response amplitude of these VIP neurons, and seeing how when the animal starts moving, they turn on. And so the idea is that this kind of looks like a general switching circuit motif, where you have this population of neurons, and then you have a VIP, or kind of like these switching units. They turn on and off to movement, and then perhaps modulate the activities of the other neurons in the circuit, and giving rise to this we can model these VIP units as binary switches that modulate the activities of other neuron population. And we can think of the VIP as some sort of context change detectors that project to other neuron populations. And we can argue that the modulation of the V1 circuit for the moving state is due to the circuit basically adapting to the visual features during movement. And this distinct neural activity during movement, perhaps we presume, enables the circuit to more efficiently process moving circuits to process moving stimuli that come as the animal is moving, that, like, as I was saying before, like they have a different statistical dependency than when the animal is static. Okay, so how do we implement such a circuit? Like I've said, we have an operational kind of static circuit and an operational moving circuit, which are ideal for these two situations. But we want to implement it in the same physical V1 switching circuit. So what we basically want is to have, like, when the animal is static, VIP is silent because VIP switches off. And we want the circuit to reproduce at least the firing rates of the optimal static circuit that I've just described. And when the animal moves, the VIP turns on. And now we want the V1 switching circuit to kind of reproduce the firing rate behavior of the optimal moving circuit. Okay, so VIP is off. And now we want the firing rate of this V1 switching circuit to be equal to the firing rate of the optimal static circuit. This is something that we found out previously from our model in part 1A, I guess. And so the easiest way to implement such a circuit is just to assign the weights between these neurons as sort of being positive W static weights and negative W static weights in the case of inhibitory to excitatory connections, and positive W static weights for the case of excitatory to excitatory connections. And the circuit given by like the rules we posited would reproduce our model. So and there's some normalization that goes on in the model as well. So we're all set. But then the VIP turns on, and now we want the firing rates of our specifically our excitatory neurons, which project further down stream to other areas, to reproduce the firing rates of our optimal moving circuit. So now it basically there's this VIP contribution to the firing rates, and we want it to reproduce these optimal moving firing rates. So it's kind of like this gives rise to sort of an optimization problem. What we're looking for are weights from to and from the VIP population. And what we're trying to optimize, or what our loss function will be in this optimization problem, is going to try to bring the firing rate of the switching circuit, the V1 model, to this optimal moving circuit. So how is the VIP interacting with this circuit to kind of reproduce an optimal firing rate that adapts super well to movement statistics? And of course, there's some biological constraints because of the excitatory to inhibitory to excitatory connection. Inhibitory connections are negative, so VIP to pyramidal will be negative, and VIP to SST will be negative because VIP is known to be an inhibitory population. And we're going to also put a pyramidal to VIP connection soon. Seems like it's necessary. So that will be positive. So to answer the question of whether we can build a switching circuit, we've translated this problem to kind of an optimization problem now, where we're basically looking at the loss function. So if I don't use any VIP neurons, and I'm just trying to use the static optimal static circuit to basically approximate the moving circuit, the loss is quite large. Then I add these VIP neurons and I see some improvement, maybe not ideal. The loss function decreases by a bit, but maybe not as much as we'd like it to. And then we add this recurrent connection from the pyramidal to the VIP, and the loss function decreases quite a bit. And then we see that when we plot like the number of VIP neurons that we need to add to get this loss function down, we see that things plateau quite quickly. And so we see that we don't need a large number of VIP neurons in order to achieve this lower loss function. Just to compare, in our model, like it's like an order of magnitude, I guess, less VIP neurons that we need than pyramidal and SST. Before I go to results and conclusions, things I'm not showing here is that this optimal circuit, because of the way it's built, it's able to very nicely sort of denoise images and videos. So if we turn on this, so when I show noisy images, when I show noisy images, I'm able to reconstruct back a denoised, this is kind of a practical application, I'm able to nicely reconstruct noisy images with this in a great way. And then when I show to the circuit videos, now I turn the VIP on, I have this extra contribution, and then I can sort of denoise the frames of the videos in a nice way. And the reason why denoising works so well so for this model is because like basically the whole model is built so that, just going back to kind of my circuit schematic that I had way back, I'm denoising so well because noise will be independent in various patches of my visual field, and neurons communicate to each other about what information it is in their patch of space. So if noise is independent across patches, this neuron here, the greenish neuron, will actually have some useful information about the patch here, so that the denoising can happen, right? So this neuron gives useful information to the bluish neuron about what happens in the surround, and it's all weighed by actual statistics of the environment, which is nice because if a line occurs a lot in the scene, then the neuron here will tell this other neuron here, hey, I see a line, maybe you should see a line too. If you don't, that's a bit unlikely. So it's useful information that these neurons communicate. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. This is most of what I wanted to talk about with this project. So we've constructed this circuit architecture complete with cell type specification, connectivities, and neuron activation that adapts and switches between contexts. And we found that I needed this recurrent connection from pyramidal to VIP neurons, which perfectly matches experimental findings, that this connection is quite strong. I found that I don't need a lot of switching VIP units in order to implement this switch. And I found that the switching circuit has superior performance in denoising videos. This is something I have just talked about, haven't explicitly showed through figures. See the paper for more details. And we've sort of matched the V1 circuit model with experimental data, again, not shown here. And so a question is, okay, this is an interesting circuit motif that we found with switching units in the visual cortex, and designed a computational model that works well. The question is, can we implement a similar architecture in an artificial neural network? Also, how much time do I have left? I don't want to.
I think we can go on for like maybe 10 more minutes, but it should be fine if you could go over a bit.
Okay, sounds great. So let me try to go pretty fast through this section. Maybe give it 5 minutes. So let's start with the data set for context switching in a digit classification task. Is sort of a pretty simplistic task. I have these MNIST digits, so just handwritten digits on various contexts. So context 1 is going to be a Gaussian noisy context, and the same digit or different digits on a more of a natural statistic context. The background here is taken from CFAR10, which has images of the CFAR10 data set where there are images of cars and airplanes and things like this. So just different backgrounds, and I'm going to also have some noise baked in, low and high noise of how much the background kind of obstructs the digit. And so I want to ask like what kind of artificial network can solve digit classification for both of these contexts, C1 and C2, but I want the network to do it kind of sequentially and in either order. So this is a framework of continual learning. the problem in continual learning is that networks forget. So once they learn context one, and they're trained on context two, they kind of forget context one. They don't remember. And so we see consistently that feed-forward networks fail to perform continual learning. So you can train on context one, then train on context two, then test again on context one, and ask, has the network forgotten context one? And so I'm testing here the catastrophic forgetting. It's a term from machine learning. Most of the figures here are from this toy example of 2-layer neural network, or 3-layer, I guess, or 2-layer, yes. But I've tested everything here on more complex architecture like VGG16, and with kind of the same results. And so what we see is that there's an accuracy decrease once you train on context one, train on context two again, and then test on context one. So there's this difference in accuracy, especially when noise is quite high. And this is so this accuracy here in the orange line is like quite distinct from an accuracy of the network that just learns context one and then is tested on context one for generalization. This is something quite expected, I'd say, right? So but we're asking, like, okay, what kind of network would we like to have to kind of avoid this problem of catastrophic forgetting? So if with a switching network, we have switching units that are off for context one and on for context two. We can train on context one with these switching units off. We can keep the weights we've learned here constant. And then train on context two. The switching is on. I'm turning on these switching units. And I'm actually only training weights to and from these layers. So they're the arrows here. So a good thing here now is we're guaranteed that this catastrophic forgetting won't happen. So if we learn how to switch, which we can do, when we see context one, we turn these switching units off, and now I can classify context one, and then when the network sees context two, it turns the switching units on and classifies context two. And so we do this sort of we designed this sort of architecture, and we see this accuracy for during switching for context one with the purple line here. And we see that this accuracy is much better than before when catastrophic forgetting did happen. And then we're even comparing the situation with just the blue line just represents a network trained on context one and tested on context one. So it's just a network trained from scratch on context one that should kind of be the upper bound on how well we're doing. But we see we're actually doing sometimes better than this, because the network probably leverages some information about, so it already learned a context, and it's some transfer learning is happening here, so that I'm actually performing a bit better than just a normal network trained on a context. So as before, kind of analogous to our biological situation, we see that adding switching units, we don't need a lot of switching units for this to happen. So we see this plateauing of the accuracy as we add more switching units. Low, we're going to have few weights to learn to and from the main network, which means I'm learning pretty fast with just adding a few units. And then, okay, so this is great. These switching units work well. But then, like, what do they actually do? So we looked at a histogram of contributions of the switching unit. So just kind of how much these switching units add, right? Because there's the recurrence here, just like in the biological model that we had to put in to kind of make it work. And so how much do the switching units modulate the main network? And so we looked at it, and it's mostly like it's a very negatively skewed distribution. So there's a lot of inhibition going on. So then we looked at the activations of the neurons in, well, neurons units, right? Because now we have an artificial neural network. We looked at the activations, and we see like there's this sparsification of activity when I'm adding the switching units, because there's an inhibition and then a ReLU that kind of zeroes out everything that's negative. So I'm inhibiting and then zeroing out. So the sparsity is quite high for the switch. And then when we look at the convolutional first layer after the switch happens, lo and behold, it seems like the switching units actually inhibit completely the background and kind of keep enough features to tell apart the digit. And this happens consistently across the data set. So this is just one example of a kind of a 3 that the network found, but then every like this background inhibition is very consistent. And so another observation here is that switching network contributions can be simplified to kind of a low rank perturbation of the weight. So I used a lot of like so the network layer gives information to the switching units, and then the switching units connect back to the main layer. And I used to use a ReLU for this sort of operation at some point here. But if you remove the ReLU, what the switching units do is just add another linear transformation of the activity at layer L minus 1, I guess, to the activity at layer L. So there's this linear term here added to the activity at the previous layer. And so the switching units I add is small. This V1, V2 is going to kind of be a low rank matrix because there's a bottleneck. So I have few units here. So I'm projecting to this lower space and then projecting back. So this will be a low rank matrix. And I see that if I remove the nonlinearity and just have this low rank matrix added, I'm doing a little worse. So the green line is slightly below the purple line. I'm doing a little bit worse. So I am losing something, but at the same time, not much. And plus, I'm doing just as well as training a circuit. As training a neural network, an artificial neural network from scratch on context 1. So it's like the blue line you can't quite see because it's because it superimposes with my green line. So basically the conclusion here is we can actually think of this switching network contribution as almost like a low rank perturbation of the weights that makes this transfer to a different context possible. Okay, so this is my short description of this project. So we've shown that feed-forward networks, any feed-forward network, just show catastrophic forgetting in continual learning, just by the way they're designed. But these biologically inspired motifs can really overcome this in specific situations. And we see that there's an inhibition of activations due to the background, like I've shown, which is an interesting mechanism. And we see how these low rank changes to weights achieve context switching essentially. And so this has been my work on artificial neural network switching. There's not much time left. I don't know if I should just do 5 more minutes on the postdoc work or just stop here and get questions, or what. I'm open to.
I think depending on the question, depending on how many people have questions, we could go for 5 more minutes if you want.
Oh, let's stop here and ask questions, and then if there's still time left, then
yeah, let's
I can do 5 more minutes on the postdoc stuff. But let's stop here. Alice, yes.
Thank you, Doris. This was really insightful. I really enjoyed getting an overview of the topics that you worked on during your PhD. I want to go back. So I think the last part was especially some of the modeling that you did in the previous parts, specifically where you first introduced that VIP population into your system. So there were 2 questions I had about, first of all, the model in general. I see that you have these 4 different populations of neurons, and there's certain connections, inhibitory or excitatory, between them. And I was wondering, what is, so how are these different blocks connected? Are these 1 neuron per population, or if you have several, how's the connection between neurons within and between populations?
Yeah, so I have multiple neurons per population. I selected such that there's per visual. So if I have an image, for every patch of image, there's multiple neurons that respond to different features, right? And so I have 1 neuron per patch per sort of like feature. So yeah, so I'm going to have like imagine a grid, and then having all these orientations. I didn't focus on spatial frequencies and stuff, for just orientation, different oriented patches, and so yeah, and then they're connected via these weights, which I kind of modeled basically.
So the weights come from training, right?
Yeah. I have images, I have videos, and I'm just kind of asking, first of all, I'm asking how much does a neuron fields. It responds very well to, let's say, this feature. And there's this feed forward. So basically, automatically what I do is I take a feature, I convolve it with the image, and the answer would be like, what is the kind of what is the result of my convolutional operation on this this patch? Average the patch values, and that's going to give me my FT here. The small FT is going to be kind of my feed forward activation. But then my neurons communicate, right? So it's not enough. So I'm going to have W static times FT, because that is the, but now you may ask, what is this weird multiplication? Because maybe normally I'd have ft plus w static ft, right? Because I'm
Mhm.
having my the feed forward stuff plus the connection. So this weird multiplications thing here, which is just it's actually a Hadamard thing. So you just multiply two vectors their values together, is because this is the operation that makes sense in like from a Bayesian perspective. So we started this model as very mathematically driven. So when writing down the kind of like Bayes rule, like my neuron models what the probability of a certain feature at a patch is. But the probability of that certain features depends on like what happens in my patch with it, which is the FT. But then like Basel kind of puts this like multiplication thing on like, well, times like the probability, like what's happening around me, because this matters a lot. It's like if what happens around me is something completely different, then maybe I'm wrong. Especially if like in normal like visual stuff, you don't see like certain features much. I mean, you're always going to see like maybe an angle like this, but maybe in nature it's not super likely. So you're gonna think twice, like your brain's gonna think twice before it infers that like maybe you see a straight line more often than like a weird angle, right? And so the probability of how often you see these features will be part of your model. And when you weird, I just didn't get into this here because it's quite a lot.
Yeah,
And
but it's super interesting. So I'm now in a group that does a lot of community, and one way to do that is via belief propagation, where you do something similar in the sense that every node looks around at what the other nodes detect, and if you detect something different from everyone around you, then you might change your detection because you figure if everyone around me believes something different, then maybe I'm wrong. So
exactly,
that's like super
exactly what these
interesting.
neurons that's
Yeah.
exactly what these neurons do. Like basically it looks at the environment, it says this is what happens most of the time, I'll take mine from that. That's why it does very well at denoising, right? Because it's like if noise is independent across patches, like I see something but my neighbor sees something else, and so we're going to help each other figure out what's going on, because like different patches have different information, right? So yeah.
That's super interesting. Thank you so much.
Any more questions?
This is totally out there. But what you were just talking about makes me think about, I'm more of a human researcher, so I'm kind of like, probably out to lunch here, but doing that type of thing with your models, like would it help with kind of like what Alice was saying, like propagation of misinformation? We'll share information with people and maybe it's wrong. And yeah, any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's great. Like I was worrying here about like the visual system, and like just this basic kind of like operations in early visual cortex. But what you're saying is, very interesting. And like in the visual cortex, this would translate to actually noise is not independent across patches, like, and that's kind of true, right? So you have these like neurons can inform each other about something bad they see and like just get to a conclusion that is actually faulty in this case. And I can see how it's very interesting, like Alice's comment and yours. Like maybe we, I think this whole framework could be adapted maybe to social networks and stuff pretty nicely. This is something cool that I haven't thought too much about because I'm too worried about individual neurons and what they do in my life. But yeah, I think that's like a super interesting perspective. So
Yeah, that was a super really insightful talk. I really enjoyed it. Um, I I think it's already past 6, so I don't want to take too much of everybody's time. But I guess we should really just give Doris another round of applause, because it's really nice. And really thank you for like being here and giving such a wonderful talk. Hopefully like you will stay in our community and then we can continue like talking more about this. Yep.
thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me and for the insights. I'm sorry I missed other talks. It's been